It began with a box, wooden, warped, and heavy with damp, found beneath the rotted floorboards of an abandoned farmhouse in western Virginia. The place was known locally as Hollow Ridge, a name whispered more than spoken, because even the air there felt older and wrong. The box was small enough to fit beneath an arm, but too solid to be ignored. The man who found it, a county surveyor marking land boundaries, said the lid stuck fast, sealed by years of mold and neglect. When he finally pried it open, the scent that escaped was thick with decay, like old leather, spoiled milk, and the earth of a grave long disturbed. Inside were photographs, black and white, their edges curling, their surfaces mottled with mildew. Faces looked back, blank-eyed, slack-jawed, strangely familiar, yet unsettlingly off. Their features were too close, eyes too far apart on one face, lips too small on another. Some smiled faintly, but not in joy, more like they were trying to remember how. There was a letter, too, folded into itself so many times the creases had nearly erased the ink. It began simply, "We have kept it pure, as he commanded. No date, no signature, just those 9 words." Local records placed the farmhouse's last residents sometime around the 1930s, a family whose name no one seemed to agree on. Holleran? Hollins? Holloway? But whose reputation lingered like the smell of smoke in an empty room. People said they didn't go into town much, didn't marry outsiders, didn't speak to strangers after dark. Some said their children never went to school, others swore they had no children, at least not the kind that could be seen. The box was turned over to the County Historical Society, but within weeks it vanished, logged, stored, and then somehow misplaced. The farmhouse, meanwhile, burned to its foundation that same year. No one rebuilt. No one even cleared the global. And yet, every now and then, hikers still report finding fragments, shards of photographs, bits of bone, a hairbrush with initials carved faintly into the handle, HR. But who, or what, did those letters really stand for? And why did an entire county spend nearly a century trying to erase Hollow Ridge from its maps? Hollow Ridge isn't the kind of place you find. It's the kind that finds you. Tucked deep within the folds of the Appalachian spine, its ridges bend like the backs of sleeping giants. The dirt roads leading there twist and vanish, swallowed by kudzu and time. Maps from the 1800s mention it only once, a faint, hand-drawn scrawl beside a dried-up creek bed. Hollow Ridge Settlement. But by the turn of the century, that name disappears, replaced with blank space, as though the land itself had been erased. Locals still talk about it, though. They call it the ridge that forgot the world. And maybe the world forgot it right back. By 1904, Hollow Ridge was home to a handful of families, maybe 5, maybe 7, who had broken off from nearby mountain towns. Coal was drying up, land was cheap, and isolation was cheaper. They built shacks out of chestnut wood, grew their food, and buried their dead behind the house. Church records note a Reverend Amos Klein tried to visit once, in 1912, but left after 2 days, writing only 3 words in his journal. They are wrong. No one knows what he meant. By the 1920s, Hollow Ridge was already more rumor than town. The census listed 23 names, though half were scratched out and rewritten with the same surname. Hollerin, a single bloodline branching inward instead of out. Neighbors claimed the family refused medical help, refused visitors, refused light. They lived by candle, by superstition, by silence. Some said the ridge had a sickness, that crops rotted before harvest and cattle were born with 2 heads. Others whispered it was punishment for what the Hollerins had done to keep their line pure. But the most chilling detail comes from a letter discovered in a courthouse attic in 1971. A clerk had filed it under undetermined deaths. It read, 3 children buried without record. No cause given. All SL. Me eyes. All same mouth. It was signed only. Midwife, Hollow Ridge, 1935. If that letter was real, and every indication suggests it was, then it meant something had been festering in those mountains far longer than anyone dared admit, and that somewhere, buried beneath the roots and ruins, lay the truth about the lost bloodline that refused to die. The Hollerins weren't always hidden. Before their name became a whisper, they were settlers, arriving sometime after the Civil War, Records show a man named Elias Holleran purchased 63 acres of mountain land in 1872 for $12 and a silver pocket watch. The deed lists no wife, no children, but within a decade, multiple births were recorded on the property, all bearing Elias's surname. Yet curiously, no marriages were ever filed. Neighbors said Elias brought his kin from another hollow up north. Others claimed he came alone and the rest appeared later. His house stood on the highest ridge, the wood blackened by soot, its windows sealed with nailed boards. Even in daylight, it looked like something meant to stay hidden. By 1890, his sons and daughters, if that's what they were, had already begun pairing off. Church elders in the nearest town, Ashcombe, tried to intervene after a rumor spread that 2 of Elias's children had taken vows among themselves. But when they arrived, they found the cabin door bolted from within and heard soft humming through the cracks in the wall, a hymn, slow and distorted, repeating only one line, "The blood must not thin." That phrase would later appear again, carved into a cellar beam discovered after the farmhouse fire decades later. The Hollerins began to withdraw completely after Elias's death, sometime around 1902. They stopped trading goods, stopped attending services, stopped burying their dead in marked graves. By 1910, only faint columns of smoke marked the ridge's survival. But their isolation had consequences. Travelers who ventured too close told of faces glimpsed through broken windows, faces that didn't look quite right. Eyes like cousins, one man wrote in a 1917 newspaper letter, mouths that smiled too wide. The Hollerins had become ghosts in their own lifetime, trapped by a doctrine only they obeyed. And when the Great Depression arrived, hunger met obsession. The family's numbers dwindled, but their devotion to keeping it pure only deepened. Some say a child was born that winter, one who bore not just the curse but the memory of every secret the ridge had buried, and it's her story that would turn rumor into horror. Her name was Martha Holleran, born in the winter of 1933, when the snow on Hollow Ridge came down so hard it sealed the cabin shut. The midwife who delivered her, the same woman whose unsigned letter would surface decades later, never returned to the ridge after that night. Some say she fled screaming into the storm, her footprints ending abruptly at the frozen creek. Those who remembered her said Martha's birth was marked by signs. The wind stopped for nearly an hour. The cattle wouldn't rise, and inside the Holleran house the candles went out all at once, as though something had entered the room that shouldn't have. For years Martha was kept out of sight. The few who glimpsed her described a child pale as snow, with hair the color of straw, and eyes that seemed to glow when the light hit them. Like she could see in the dark, an old logger once said. Others insisted her face looked like more than one person, as if several generations had been pressed together into a single expression. She was rarely allowed outside. When she was, it was only after dusk, her feet bare even in winter. She wandered the yard, humming the same strange hymn that her grandfather once sang, the one about the blood never thinning. By 1941, a state census taker was dispatched to Hollow Ridge to verify population numbers. He wrote a brief note before leaving. Met one child, girl about 8, watched from attic window, wouldn't blink. He never returned for follow-up. When the farmhouse burned 2 years later, the fire was so intense that neighbors claimed it could be seen from Ashcombe 10 miles away. Every Holleran inside was presumed dead, except one. A week later, a hunter discovered footprints in the soot leading toward the tree line. Small, bare, and perfectly spaced. He followed them until they simply stopped, mid-trail, as though the ground had swallowed the child whole. Some believed Martha died that night. Others whispered she survived, carried the bloodline elsewhere, and began it anew under another name. But if she did, where did she go? And why do some modern birth records in nearby counties still list her family's distinct genetic mark? After the fire, Hollow Ridge should have vanished quietly into history, just another lost settlement consumed by poverty, superstition, and the unforgiving mountains. But something strange happened instead. Within a year, the records began to disappear. The 1930 census pages for the Ashcombe district, the ones that listed the Hollerins, went missing from county archives. Marriage certificates, birth registries, even death ledgers, all either misfiled or burned in accidental courthouse fires between 1944 and 1947. When state genealogists attempted to reconstruct the lineage, they found only fragments, repeated names, overlapping dates, and signatures that looked like they'd been written by the same trembling hand. One line, however, kept appearing in official documents, a notation scribbled in pencil along the margins, possible relocation, Hampshire Company, West Virginia. That single clue led investigators to a remote farmhouse outside of Romney, abandoned since the late 1950s. Inside, they found furniture overturned, windows nailed shut, and initials carved into a doorframe, the same faint HR found on the hairbrush from the original Hollow Ridge box. In a corner of the attic, beneath years of dust, lay a photograph sealed inside a cracked frame. It showed a young woman standing in a field barefoot, holding an infant. The caption read, in faded ink, Martha, 1948. But what chilled researchers most wasn't the picture. It was the faces. Both woman and child had that same indistinct, unsettling symmetry, as if the human form had folded in on itself. When state officials attempted to verify the photograph's origin, the evidence mysteriously vanished again. The file clerk assigned to the case resigned 2 weeks later, citing unusual interference. By the 1960s, locals began reporting sightings near the old property, pale figures moving at dusk, soft, singing drifting through the trees, the same melody, the same words. The blood must not thin. And even more unnerving, local schools began documenting children born with rare facial deformities and genetic anomalies, all tracing back loosely to families who had once lived along the ridge's shadow. The state called it coincidence. But what if it wasn't? What if the Holleran bloodline never ended, only hid, adapting, surviving, and passing unseen through generations? By the 1970s, Hollow Ridge had become more legend than location, a ghost story parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. Yet for those who studied Appalachia's darker history, the name still lingered like a bruise. Anthropologists from the University of Virginia began cataloging rural myths in 1976, and among their notes lies one file that was never published, labeled simply, Case Study, The Ridge Blood. The report describes a series of interviews with elderly residents from nearby hamlets, people who remembered the fire, the strange singing, and the girl who walked out of smoke. One woman, a retired teacher, recalled a visit from a quiet child in 1949 who enrolled under the name Martha Ray. She said the girl spoke proper, but her eyes weren't right. They looked remembered. The same teacher vanished the following spring. Her farmhouse was found empty, her tea still warm. The only thing missing was her class photograph and the student roster. Miners working the mountainside later claimed that the ridge wasn't just cursed, it was hollow in more ways than one. Beneath it, they said, ran a labyrinth of caves once used during the Civil War. Voices were often heard echoing from inside, whispers that carried even without wind. One miner swore he saw lantern light deep underground, flickering where no tunnel should have reached. When investigators checked decades later, they found carvings in the rock, initials, dates, and a single phrase etched over and over again. Blood remembers. Folklorists dismissed it as vandalism. But DNA mapping from rural Appalachian families conducted in the early 2000s revealed something no one expected. A rare mutation, consistent across dozens of lineages spanning 4 counties. A mutation that could only have originated from one ancestral source. One that dated back to Hollow Ridge. Locals still don't talk about it. Some refuse to buy land near the ridge. Others keep their lights burning through the night, afraid that what lives beneath the mountain hasn't forgotten them. And when the wind shifts just right, they say you can still hear the old song drift through the trees, soft, steady, and unbroken. The blood must not thin. The story should have ended there, buried beneath the ash, the silence, and the weight of years too ashamed to remember. But history has a way of breathing, even when we try to suffocate it, and sometimes the dead do not rest. In 2019, a volunteer historian cataloging rural genealogical archives uncovered an unmarked box. Inside were brittle newspaper clippings, a rusted pocket watch, and a photograph nearly identical to the one labeled Martha, 1948. This time, though, there was a second woman beside her, older, heavier, with the same piercing eyes and that same faint, unnerving smile. The back read, Hollow Ridge, 1961. The line continues. DNA testing on the hair sample found inside the envelope linked it to 3 living families in the region, all unrelated on paper. all bearing traces of that same rare genetic marker scientists had traced to the mountains decades before. When contacted, one descendant agreed to speak. She described strange illnesses in her family, uncanny resemblances that skipped generations, and dreams. Dreams of a house that never existed, where someone sang in the dark. When shown the photograph, she grew silent and whispered, "That's my grandmother's face. But it can't be." Some say the Hollerins still walk the ridge, not as ghosts, but as memories carried in flesh and bone. The curse was never supernatural. It was human, the product of isolation, obsession, and a belief that purity was worth any price. Yet what began as a choice became a destiny that outlived them all. Maybe that's why the woods around Hollow Ridge remain empty, why no one cuts its trees or builds their homes there. They say the soil itself feels wrong, as if the ground remembers what it was fed. And when the fog rolls down the mountain, it moves slow, like breath over an open grave. The box, the photographs, the initials, all lost again, locked away in archives that refuse to stay still. But some nights, beneath the hum of cicadas, the wind still carries a tune, faint, haunting, and heartbreakingly familiar. The blood must not thin. So ask yourself, if you traced your own blood far enough, how certain could you be that it wouldn't lead back there?